You are at another episode of Talk About Bupkes, the Bupkes podcast. I am Noel Puchovich, the Secretary General of Words of the Bupkes. We have Saul Noam Zaritt, Yiddish professor at Ohio State University, who has, among many other things, written a super awesome, interesting, brain-bending book. Not only for people who are interested in Jewish culture, politics, the role of nationalism, Yiddish, development of language, but people are generally interested in these things beyond and outside of anything Jewish as well, which I think, as your book argues, is also very Jewish, the ins and outs of Jewishness. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to keep talking about, we're going to go back to talking about. And you've written most recently this 2024 book. 2023. Oh, I've read that elsewhere in 2024. Anyway, recent book, A Teist Manifesto, which is all about these questions of like, what is it? What is Yiddish?
Maybe it is 2024. Maybe you're right.
Well, okay. What's a year in Yiddish, history, right? Let's talk about that word Teist, which is, we go back to Deutsch, which goes back to Deutsch, and it really speaks to that Jewish-German connection, at least when we're speaking about Jewish culture, Jewish identities. I think plural is very important in a European context.
Okay, so the word Teich, which just means German, was one of the earliest names of the Yiddish language. So when Jewish communities, say 600, 700, 800 years ago, were living in Germanic lands, wanted to name the language that they were speaking, they named it as Teich because they were indeed speaking the language they had learned from the communities around them. But that language was also slightly different than that non-Jewish language in the sense of they had brought with them both the languages they had brought with migration from Northern Europe and Southern France, so lots of Romance language, and of course, lots of Hebrew and Aramaic. And the idea was that, when you're speaking to someone that you know, you don't need to name the language that you're speaking because you know that the both of you are mutually intelligible. You don't need to say, we aren't speaking English now because we don't need to name it as such. So language names are always a very strange and fickle thing because they're usually imposed from the outside or meant as some kind of projection to those on the outside if you could sort of understand what we are doing and communicate it to somebody else. And so the idea that you don't really need to name the language, or the language that you speak is not necessarily Jewish in any way, but that is just sort of a language that happens to be constructed in particular ways. This was an opportunity to just say, no, actually, we speak a Germanic language. We speak like those around us in some ways. But then, there would be this moment of encounter in which this particular Germanic language or that they're speaking did not cohere necessarily with everything that a non-Jewish person was speaking. There had to be this admission that, well, actually, sometimes we speak a Yiddish Teich, we speak a Jewish kind of German, or that we speak unser Loschen, we speak our language and not their language. This kind of anxiety about what exactly constitutes Jewish speech. And so the point of the book is to start thinking about, well, what is this thing that we name as Jewish? What is it? What happens when we name something as Jewish? What particular kind of projection or act of naming are we doing in that process? The idea of Yiddish being named as a Jewish language is something that was imposed on a language for the most part in the 19th and 20th century. Yiddish was not known as Yiddish until that time, until there was a set of intellectuals that wanted to name and claim and normalize the language.
Which is an interesting time frame, given what else other developments in terms of ideas of nationalism and state get more into. It's interesting to say, like, when you speak English, you speak any language, you don't think about it in those terms. It always reminds me when I was a kid, I would be like, do the Chinese speak Chinese like we speak English? Like, is that how they think about things? And in a parallel to that with Yiddish, the word Yiddish in Yiddish, the Yiddish word for Yiddish sounds like super fine and normal, but it means Jewish. Mm-hmm. And when you say it in English, or whatever your native language might be, it does sound weird. Like, I speak Jewish. What does that even? It almost sounds derogatory. Like, it sounds weird. Like, what is that? Is that what kind of development was that? Was that from an internal development? Was it an external development? Was it being imposed on you? Like, you speak Yiddish, you speak Jewish, or we speak Jewish? And what did that even mean for what it meant for the people speaking Jewish?
Yeah. So this gets to a sense of what does it mean, what you started talking about before.
Yeah.
But maybe
we're still talking about it.
Yeah. Was the idea of what does it mean, or what is the uniqueness of Jewishness, especially in the context of the the Christian European nation state when
Right.
it comes to being. This idea of being named as a particular kind of population. There are lots of different kinds of diversity in all of Europe. Europe, right? The idea of there being something like German being a stable thing, right? We noticed we've spoken about the Germanic language or Germanic languages, not about German as a whole. German comes into being um, only through the imposition of the nation state over a series of different kinds of Germans that exist over different kinds of empires or different kinds of nation states today, and that there isn't just one German as much as the bureaucratic state wants to impose a particular
Right.
German on its populations. And so, too, there's all these kinds of diversity. We have to think about what particular kind of difference does Jewishness represent among the other different kinds of difference, say Roma populations, Eastern European populations existing within Germanic lands, and all of these other kinds of diversities that you might find. So Jewishness has a particular function, both socially and politically, and also racially, but also theologically within the conception of the Christian nation state as it comes into being in the early modern and then in the modern period. Um, and that means something. So the whole idea of the creation of race, or the notion that there's a kind of biological difference to Jewish bodies, comes out of the idea of what's called die Rassenfrage. Die Rassenfrage and die Judenfrage, big, philosophical and theological notions, coincide with one another. How do
And
you
went to some great
describe
places. Yeah.
yeah, how to describe this difference? What does this difference mean? How does the nation state compensate for this difference, erase this difference in certain places, or give special place to it? And so Jewish language practices have a particular place within that. So Christianity has a difficult problem with the Hebrew language. It is the language of God, it's the language of the Old Testament, but then it has to be superseded by, right, the language of Christian diversity, whatever that means. And so there's a lots of what they're called Hebraists, Christian Hebraists, trying to learn Hebrew in order to get closer to the source, in order to, in some ways, supersede in some way. This idea of supersession, superseding Christianity over Judaism. And so too, its various language processes. So that, right, what kind of language does a Jew speak? A Jew always speaks a corrupted language, a primitive language. So that there was a lot of study in the early modern period of Yiddish by Christian populations. The first grammars and dictionaries we have of the Yiddish language are by Christian authorities of various kinds, trying to proselytize or in some ways denigrate these Jewish populations that were destroying German or were bastardizing the language, but through their imperfect or impure speech.
There's a method of control.
Method of control, yes, but also a method of analysis that in analyzing this bad German or this bad form of Jewish speech, you can thereby create the good kind of German speech, right? By identifying those outliers, identifying those things that are other in a fundamental way, name them as Jewish as such, regardless of whether they were indeed Jewish forms of speech, you can therefore create what you imagine to be this internal and perfect identity. So whole notions of identity within Europe require various others in order to create them. To create the idea of the citizen, of a German or a French person, you need a variety of things that you reject. That is the sort of function of Christian ideas of identity. And so there are different ones. There's the Roma, there's the Jews, and of course there's the colonial other various different forms of colored folks that are elsewhere, right? So that can be your North African and Oriental figures. It could be your distant, far away Eastern and Oriental figures, and then of course the African slave and African body. So these are the different forms of other within which Jewishness has a particular function as what sometimes referred to as the internal other, right? The person who is of Europe in some way, who is of Christianity in some way, since Christianity subsumes or purports to subsume Judaism or supersede it, but that is still an other, an irritant, a kind of imperfect function within that system.
Because it has to see what it's not.
Yes, and lots of different kinds of what it's not. in order to constitute itself.
Your book is, I've noticed, and this might be a function of your writing or a function of your editor, or maybe a bit of both. Your book is really careful. Like every word seems very intentionally chosen. Every sentence seems really intentionally chosen. I could feel how much care you took in expressing your ideas. And so I'm interested that the title of the book is not the Types Manifesto, it's a Types Manifesto. Is there any meaning to that or reason to that or thinking about that?
Yes, because I think when I was the early parts of thinking about this project, I was like very fiery. I was going to like destroy everything. If you think about
Burn it down.
Writing a manifesto, you want to like say this is prescriptive. And
yeah, manifesto is very strong.
It is prescriptive in some ways. I won't deny that it's a very polemical book, but I didn't want to discount and throw away work that has been done or thought that has been done about Yiddish. Or about anything else within modern Jewish studies. Certain people, things that I argue with, but this idea that, there are other manifestos to come, there's not just one, or that this is the end all and be all. It's offering in that way a kind of method of reading. That's how I often talk about it in the book. This is a way to read cultural contact. This is a way to read certain forms of linguistic and cultural instability. Even within all the different other kinds of manifestos that might be out there that are also allowed to flourish and function. So this is a Taich manifesto among many more manifestos that I myself could issue, but that also contends with what I imagine to be other manifestos at the same time. So if the book is often arguing against or struggling with this notion of normalization, I'm not saying that normalization is bad, right? Normalization, or the idea of trying to solidify Yiddish as a language, as a coherent language of a coherent set of populations, has been beneficial for Yiddish in a lot of ways, created some of the institutions that preserve or conserve certain forms of Jewish and Yiddish collectivity that are vital to the language's continued presence or continued activity around the language. All the different archives that we have are due to those kinds of projects. And many of the communities around Yiddish owe their existence to these particular forms of normalization. But I want to say in some sense that the project of normalization is a manifesto. Yiddish needs to be a normal language. Yiddish is a language of a particular population. Yiddish has these values, or Yiddish is funny in this way, or Yiddish can only express this or that thing. These are the kinds of things that, many who have made a claim on Yiddish have had those claims, who have made these kinds of manifestos about the language. And I don't want to discount those manifestos, even if I might critique them. So yes,
it is that paradox, like to save something, you kind of have to destroy it a little bit in the effort of saving it or preserving it.
I think that it's not a paradox. It's just the result of saving something.
So on that note, what was your motivation for writing? Why did you feel so compelled to write a polemic, to write a manifesto? You could have written about Yiddish in many different ways or not written about it at all. I mean, you're a Yiddish professor, so I guess it leads to your work.
I would say some of it has to do with, on one hand, the field of Jewish studies in general having at times, and not always, a fear of theory or a reticence to deal with theory. Jewish studies, like some other forms of, say, fields that are around a particular identity, tend to value or celebrate that identity. So Jewish studies, as it came into being, say in the 1970s, was as a professional figuration within the American Academy in the 1970s, often saw itself, whether consciously or unconsciously, as representative of the Jewish community. Right? Jewish studies is meant to speak to or work for some kind of set of constituents, working for the Jewish people in some sense. And I think that has meant that at times there was a kind of blindness about theorizing the very word Jew or Jewish. You think about this in comparison with something like Black studies or Black study, the term Black is a central figure of critique, what it means to be named as Black, or what the word Black does, what are the instabilities of that term, the genealogies of that term, how it's been used or imposed upon Black communities, African-American communities. Whereas theorizing the word Jew or theorizing Jewishness in a critical sense around the different forms of race or inculcations of ethnic identity or even ideas of empire within which Jewishness has a particular function wasn't always a priority. There was the sense that scholars of Jewish studies just simply needed to tell the history or tell the story of of the Jews.
And not really asking why or how, just like what happened.
Well, sometimes asking why or how, but not critiquing about what the actual object of study is, right? Just as taking Jews as self-evident in some way, as opposed to thinking
like
about
as a fixed thing that it is what it is.
oh,
We all know what we're talking
over
about.
thousands of years. You know, these are the Jews.
We were all at Sinai.
That scholars are a little bit more careful than that. I don't want to make sort of generalizations like that, but that their responsibility was, and this is a very crude generalization, so not everyone, but to tell the story of the Jewish people, as opposed to think critically about the formation of Jewishness. What does Jewishness? What does the naming of something as Jewish do to the object? Not what it does for the Jewish people. So that's one motivation, sort of like, I want to write this book to get us to think very critically about Jewishness and also think about the term Yiddish in a way that we haven't. This isn't to say that there haven't been lots of theorizations about Yiddish, which I quote and deal with in the book, but that they're old and that they deserve to be unpacked, whether these be the ideas by, Max Weinreich, one of the founders of the field of Yiddish studies, to Benjamin Harshav and his theories of Yiddish around semiotics of Yiddish, to many other people like that, but just sort of think about, what are the things that we've already been doing? What are the things that we are already theorizing without making them clear that these are the theories or thoughts about what Yiddish is? So it's a way to kind of gather together work by a lot of my colleagues. Think about Noam Simon on translation and other kinds of work like that. That's already to the contemporary, and think about what is it that we're doing and what could we be doing in a different way. So a lot of it is sort of like taking great work that people are doing and pushing it in a certain direction. Part of your book is again history of the Jews, but a part of your work is actually about translation or about cultural contact. And where can we push the field to think critically about those moments and put them in the center of ours?
And this is why you're advocating in your book and also elsewhere for this idea of creation of not just Jewish studies, but Jew studies, which I find
Jew theory.
Mm-hmm. Which first of all, I find great because I think that just that word Jew will make a lot of non-Jews uncomfortable. Like a lot of people can't even say Jew, it's a Jewish person, which is kind of funny because what else? A bit anti-Semitic, I think, to suggest that they're not. So you were already starting to get into that. Maybe get into a little more like what would Jew theory even mean? What would that look like? If you sort of expressed what's missing, what would it fill? How would that work differently than what other fields of studying and thinking and scholarship already exist?
Yeah. So this thinking about this term came out of, I was in these various seminars with people that were thinking in similar terms to me about like, what do we call what we do? Jewish studies sort of aligned with, say, ethnic studies, Asian American studies, or all these other kinds of like ethnic or identity markers. But what does this add to thinking about the world and thinking about modernity? Or what does it do that's different from other forms? Are we just applying other theories, post-colonial theory, whatever, onto the Jewish case? Or what does it mean to be always considering the Jewish case like it was some kind of, again, objective thing? And people came up with the ideas of like critical Jewish cultural studies. These were other terms that have been banded out in the 90s and early 2000s. And, I was thinking about, this is critical race theory. There's also something called queer theory. There's all these, why don't we actually use the terms that we're using as the critical terms that we need to be interrogating as part of describing what we're doing? Rather than distancing it within something like Jewish or adding the word critical, why don't we put front and center the critical and uncomfortable object of study? So Jew. So Jew theory would be the idea of being able to do the same thing that one does with queer theory, say, or similar, in which you can queer everything, or you can read everything as somehow embedded within a story around queerness, especially in the modern period. So you watch a movie, it's a rom-com, but you want to understand, what are the queer moments in this rom-com? When the two men are fighting over one woman, what actually they are attracted to one another, right? You read the queer moment into the story. or you read against the grain to find what is the queer romance that might be embedded in this heterosexual fantasy.
That's what I think about Top Gun.
Yes, Top Gun, any triangular relationship you can read in a queer way. And so the question is, can you do the same thing with Jewishness? Famously, within rom-coms, many of them written by Jews and the reflection of certain forms of Jewish experience, rom-coms involve often the creation or invention of a sensitive male over and against a powerful, male, like
Alpha male,
yeah. Right? And the choosing of the sensitive over the destructive male figure. And so you can read, right? If we want to do Jew theory, how can we read the Jewishness into the rom-com construction, right? How can we read that sort of reconfiguration of gender around a sort of Jewish informed set of stereotypes, right? That would be doing Jew theory. It doesn't always work the same way that queer theory doesn't always read everything or can't read everything completely, but can it be a kind of tool within within the way we read modernity? Similarly, when thinking about economics, the economics behind or embedded within a particular novel. So if you look at 19th century novels, of which I've been reading a number of these days, you'll always be able to find the colonial undercurrent of a 19th century British novel. The rich aristocrats of that world are always making their money somewhere in the Indies off the page or mentioned very briefly. Right? So there's always some kind of colonial component, and that would be a good post-colonial reading or reading against the grain of many of these novels. But also embedded in the economic construction of these novels will be some kind of figure of a middleman or a nouveau riche character that appears often in 19th century British and American fiction who has a vague and unclear past associated with them, right? You could do Jew theory reading of those figures, regardless of whether the character is meant to be biologically or genealogically Jewish, but you could read that person's function within the text as a kind of Jewishness or a Jewish stereotype being deployed within the writing of the text. So this is what I mean by Jew theory. And in other words, one of the main parts of the project would be to take stereotypes seriously. I don't mean take stereotypes seriously as some kind of truth, but take it as a object that functions in the world beyond the biological population-based idea of Jewishness. That both of those things exist. There are actual Jews, but the idea of the figural Jew is actually a really powerful way to understand and read modern cultural objects.
And just as you say, you gave the movie example, there's a lot of Jews that are writing these movies. There's also a lot of Jews in the academy who have developed and are involved in all these other kinds of theories. Mm-hmm. So in what way would Jew theory be different than all these other theories that already exist? Because they're already so imbued with a Jewishness.
Yeah, so Jew theory is not different. Again, I'm not in the academy. We're so obsessed with things being new or like revolutionary,
filling a gap in the knowledge.
Yes,
as they like to say.
And for me, Jew theory is a way to reorganize or reorient our attention, so that you could go back and say, yes, Marx is a Jew theorist, right? In his
speaking of manifestos,
yes, no, not in the Communist Manifesto necessarily, but his essay on the Jewish question, in which he's theorizing Jewishness in a particular way. Or there's plenty of your Frankfurt School and all your other kinds of theorists that have some idea about Jewishness as in their theorization of the 19th and 20th century. But it would go even so far as to think about something like Afro-pessimism, a very important and upcoming and now, I guess, relatively established idea of thinking of critically about race. Afro-pessimism often has built within it theorization of Jewishness. So famously, the figure that many Afro-pessimists turn to as a kind of originary figure or prefiguring many of their ideas is Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon, when he's talking about Blackness and how to describe or how it comes into being, his constant figure of comparison is the Jewish case. And so that too is a theorization of Jewishness. Fanon too is a Jew theorist in some sense, at least in the way I would read it, in which what does it mean that in order to theorize Blackness, you need a theory of Jewishness? How do we understand that? What is that? How does that work? What are the lines of influence or the lines of communication between those different kinds of thinkers that otherwise don't always have much to say to us?
You talk about Yiddish it as vulgar, as a vulgarity. And I was,
One Yiddish, yeah.
yeah, a Yiddish, a
Mhm.
type of Yiddish. Could you speak more about that? What you mean by that?
Yeah, so this is another thing about trying to take stereotypes seriously in the sense that just because you don't like a kind of Yiddish doesn't mean that it doesn't exist or needs to be destroyed or is somehow illegitimate. So Yiddish has had many paths and continues to have many paths. And one of those paths, one of the most dominant and most legible paths, is that Yiddish has become a language of of American, not just Jewish American, but of American comedy. Um, because of its embeddedness within, say, vaudeville in the late 19th and early 20th century, in creations of Hollywood, and then certainly in the post-war period with the rise of the Jewish comedy as such, as an institutional figure, a figure that has a lot of money and sway within those spaces. Um, it's a particular kind of audience legibility. So there may not be lots of Jews in the audience, but there's a lot of audience that understands and reads Yiddish or a certain form of Yiddish or Yiddish inflected speech as hilarious and as particularly American. This has to do with ideas of, certain kinds of mockery of the immigrant or mockery of the model immigrant in various ways. It also has a lot to do with race, a sort of accepting of certain forms of white Jewishness or Jewishness that becomes whiteness over and against other kinds of difference within America. Jewishness is allowed to be funny in a way that blackness or Latin Americanness or Asianness is not in America. So, like Yiddish or Yiddish inflected speech is so powerful, and its vulgarness is so important to this kind of sanctification or stabilization of race within American entertainment. That it's taken on its own life. The idea of Yiddish being funny is about, say, 100, 120 years old. But that's a long time. Yeah. We think that Yiddish is eternally funny, but it's not. Yiddish only became funny, say, in the late 19th century. But certainly in American comedy, has it's such an enduring and canonical place. Like you would think, and they thought this already in the 1950s, oh, like there'll be Jewish humor, but it'll end in like 10, 15 years once the immigrant generation dies out.
Because there'll be no more
There'll be
Yiddish.
no Yiddish. There'll be no more Yiddish speakers. But like Larry David still makes a living off of Jewish inflected speech because it is so legible, right? Regardless of whether you know anything, if you know any, no one knows any Yiddish speakers. Larry David doesn't know any Yiddish speakers. Larry David doesn't know a word in Yiddish beyond those words that have entered the American lexicon. And so that's not negligible. Those are canonized. They're passed down from generation to generation. So as an example that's in the book, the term verklempt, which people imagine to be such an important and like ubiquitous Yiddish word, most Yiddish speakers don't, native Yiddish speakers don't use that word very often. It's not ubiquitous. So you get, but it was introduced by Coffee Talk by
Mhm.
Mike Myers in the early 90s. And it became such a fixture that it's like a word Obama uses all the time. It's a word that, Tressie McMillan, very important cultural critic and writer for the New York Times, and just a great social media person. She's a great follow. She uses the word verklempt a lot. And then there are people who can swear, oh, I definitely heard my grandmother or my mother heard her grandmother use this word verklempt all the time. When in fact, that absolutely didn't happen. So it has a kind of, and people know that to be a vernacular word. And it is in that sense vernacular. So yeah, Yiddish vulgarity in the use of stereotype or the development of stereotype or stereotype having its own set of afterlives that the original language population has no control over, then creates this whole other Yiddish, this other like non-native or sometimes referred to as post-vernacular Yiddish that has its own life, irrespective of the world it may have originated in.
And you say like it's only a relatively recent development. This sort of Yiddish became grounded as sort of a funny language. But but then as you also say, that's a long time. That is the entire history of recording so the only actual things we can hear and see and go back to in the archive. I mean, written, of course, but to hear it to actually enjoy is in the entire period of that sort of transformation, I imagine. So, um, it's interesting how I mean, there's obviously historical processes and reasons, immigration, pogroms, Holocaust, that like sort of reimagine Yiddish in an American context. maybe we can move back into Europe where you are now, or we are now. I'd love to know more of your experience. And I'm trying to figure out the question I want to ask because I myself struggle with this idea that, Yiddish is from here, but as we just talked about, it has this very strong, it's actually almost more identifiable in the United States, people who maybe have never even traveled to Europe.
Mhm.
And I'm interested in that sort of the transatlantic sort of flow of ideas and culture and how this very Jewish thing that was European now isn't. And what your experience is as you bring these kinds of ideas and you talk with people here, what that's been like, or how that how that affects how you're thinking.
Yeah, no, the diaspora nationalists in the early 20th century loved to say, very proud to say, that Yiddish was a European language, that it was a European language before all these other languages. It's like an age, right, that Yiddish is born of Europe. Right, though. Like, what do you gain? So not about whether Yiddish is essentially European in some way, but what do you gain from naming it as European? So the diaspora nationalists want to name it as Europe in order to achieve or establish some kind of nativeness that could be named and categorized within these kinds of nation state formations, right? We are diaspora nationalists. We deserve a certain kind of autonomy. We deserve to be recognized in some way. We deserve institutional presence. That's why you would name it as Europe. But to say that Yiddish is essentially a European thing would be deny its mobility, right? So from the 19th century, Yiddish is no longer a European thing, right? Because Yiddish moves to South America, to South Africa, to Australia, to, of course, the United States, to Western Europe, to all different kinds of places, as far off as to the Asian countries of various kinds, just because that's where Yiddish-speaking communities were moving towards. So, um, and then, of course, there's the argument of some linguists that Yiddish is indeed not even a Germanic language, but that is actually better categorized as a Slavic language because of how much it borrows from Russian and other Slavic languages. So, yeah, I don't. Yeah, I'm not. Yeah, so I'm not exactly sure what that means, and that, of course, creates this kind of complexity when I'm here and
A
people
lot of things smashing together.
identify Yiddish as something that should be intelligible, or that you're always getting this question: well, how much German do you understand? Or can you speak German since you speak Yiddish? Right, you're returning home in that sense. No one says that we're home, but there's that kind of tension around what is this, you know, I'm talking about this overlap between Yiddish and German, or talking about this kind of intimacy. But intimacy comes with violence, and that's part of what's interesting to me. And so I always use this example when I'm talking to people about the word genau, which is a word that German speakers, at least nowadays, use all the time. It's like a word they use to say right or yes. They're nodding about something. They say genau,
Gotcha.
genau, 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 genau. And in Yiddish, you would never say that. At least in the Yiddish that I've learned, you would never say genoi, which is the word you would say it in some version of Yiddish, which is like, it's much too exact. You say genoi only when you mean you're exactly and perfectly correct.
Which is never probably.
No, I don't know if it's never, but it's just there's a kind of around certain forms of speech around Yiddish that were developed in the 19th and 20th century. There's certain forms of uncertainty that have been important to that culturally in those moments. I'm not saying it's essential to Yiddish, but it's certainly to a certain set of speakers and communities. You would answer your answer to talking to someone, and if you were talking to them, you'd say nu, 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 which is like an asking for more in some sense, or a kind of skepticism that's expected of speakers of Yiddish in certain contexts that would not make sense by saying genoi, genoi, or genau, genet. And so I'm always constantly coming up against those sensibilities, in the sense that I learned very particular sensibilities about Yiddish around the skepticism, say around the word nu, or just around the way the feeling of the rhythm of speech that I was taught, and that I sort of heard from my grandparents, but that I also was taught in the classroom and read in on all the literature that I'm reading. And so for me, it's really hard to align those sensibilities with what I'm hearing as German sensibilities, which have their various stereotypes that people try to live up to, right? This idea that German is an exacting language, I'm sure has something to do with the use of the word genau. It's not that Germans are objectively more exacting and more direct about things. It's just that they know that that stereotype exists and feel like they have to live up to
So
it.
you're reproducing sort of an idea that's been put on you, which then
Yeah.
creates the idea.
Right. And when they ask me, you know a lot of German, What they're also saying is you don't know German, right? You're close, but not how much do you understand? Acknowledging or being already certain that I don't understand everything, right? So that there's a kind of encounter when they see me as someone who speaks Yiddish or studies Yiddish, that there's something that is coming close to them that they want to keep apart. That is part of the logic behind asking me, how much German do you understand?
Is there a purity element there?
Yeah, there is. Yeah. So when someone asks you, like, how much English do you understand? If you were to go up to an immigrant, right, in the United States and ask them, how much English do you understand? And based on whatever racial profiling you did of that person, they're like, actually, I'm from, Jersey.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you're being racist, right?
Yeah.
Like that's an easy for us as Americans. You understand that as a racist comment. Ask someone, how good is your English?
Yeah.
Right? And I'm not saying that people are being racist against me, but by the figure of Jewishness that they see on me in my body or in my reputation or in the subject I study, they immediately like that is figured and projected onto a kind of language hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
Not that they're saying German is better than Yiddish, but that they want to or can reconfirm a kind of gap between
That there's
even
difference.
as they're acknowledging that there's something a little bit too close about.
I think that gets to this idea of fluency, like having speaking German, speaking other languages, and people ask you like, "Are you fluent?"
Mm-hmm.
Like, there is no fluent
Mm-hmm.
because language is fluid,
Mm-hmm.
and like depending on the context and how much sleep you got that day and whatever, a million other factors. Sometimes you're fluent and sometimes you're not. And
Right.
fluency doesn't even mean what you think it means.
Can you pass as being from here?
Right. Is it that's what you would say
Yeah, that's one of the things that they're asking you.
Right.
Like, can you pass? Are you going to embarrass me? Are you embarrassing? Are you not socially capable? Is your difference too readable in some sense? Or maybe they like that about you. They want you to be different. They want you to be your difference to be something that you can perform to whatever benefit that for them or for you or for other community you might represent.
Which is interesting because I mean this is in many countries and many cultures and many languages, but German, there's so many Germans,
Mm-hmm.
right? Germans people, but German's the language. You go to Bavaria, or you really go anywhere. Bavaria is always the best example, but there's lots of examples. It's a totally different German, but they're not. They're from here, whatever that's supposed to mean.
Right, and I'm not saying that those regional identities should be canceled in them, or those differences should be canceled. In fact, they're very beneficial. Feeling like you're from somewhere, that you have a kind of regional identity, or creates a sense of community that can be built upon or played with in various ways. But that, embedded in those assumptions are various stereotypes, and Jewishness being one of them that can function positive ways. People were trying to engage with me, like they wanted to say that I'm paying attention to you, I'm seeing you, but that all of those stereotypes are explosive in one way or another.
Yeah, this gets I think back to what you're talking about stability, the real or imagined stability, or in the inverse, instability of a language. And I'd love to learn more about that. What you mean by a language being stable, or the idea of a language being stable that's not really stable. And most importantly, what the implications of that are.
Yeah, linguistic stability is an obsession of the nation state, right? So the nation state, as such, is always invested in the rational, um, organization of its population, and be able to identify exactly who someone is, put them in their place, and then be able to keep them and control them in that space, right? So the modern nation state is interested in absolute control. That's how it works. That's how it benefits people in some ways, but often how it is an apparatus of control. And language is one of those levers around which they can offer that control. That's why, as my colleague Ross Perlin can tell you here at the Academy, minor languages or languages of small communities are disappearing because they make it difficult for the government to govern and to control its population. And so, your ability to speak otherwise is another way of saying that there's some disjunction between you and the state. That's the sort of main way I would answer your question.
So that gets more into the world of politics, probably since the 19th century. Your book, what I really like about it is it's a very political book without being very political, at least explicitly or on the nose. We're talking about huge questions of Jewish identity or Jewish identities, but Israel doesn't really come up in any explicit way. Zionism doesn't really come up in any explicit way, except for as a historical reference that this is a thing that existed. And I'm wondering, first of all, why was that a conscious choice? Why that was? And how what you're talking about Yiddish and how it sort of challenges the idea of the nation state and the ethnic nation state, how that kind of that interplay within the development of the idea of a Jewish national project.
Yeah, so I run afoul of various other Yiddishists when I call them nationalists. They don't like it, which is fine. And, my definition of nationalism is kind of big, and I'll acknowledge that. But that, acts of normalization, as beneficial as they are, like I mentioned, institutionalization, are often about investing in the nation state as such. You have a friend here who's working on who's like excited to try to get Yiddish as a language that can be recognized to be taught in high schools or elementary schools here in Berlin or elsewhere in Germany. And that requires a kind of investment in the state and the way the state might be able to recognize it. That's the whole point. They want, like, that's what they need in order to place you in a particular box, and that allows you, or it forces you to adopt a particular rhetoric and self-expression which will make you identifiable to the state, and that requires a certain kind of nationalism of some kind in order to promote your language. And I'm not saying that should be rejected, because there there's advantages to working with an institution or working through institutionalization, but that we run into this problem all the time when it comes to fundraising for the work that an academic does or that anybody does, right? In order to raise money for something like Jewish studies scholars constantly have to appeal to something like the Jewish community or the fate of the Jewish people. That is what is going to draw certain forms of capital that are associated with certain forms of identity that those people with capital identify with. And in order to do the work you want to do, you need to appeal to those folks. So there's a kind of push and pull between this kind of encouragement that I'm making to reconceptualize things around different forms of community, different forms of porousness between borders of identity, or throwing out identity as much as possible towards a certain kind of cross-cultural solidarity that do not function within the structures of capital that make up, our world. Now, what that has to do with Zionism and Israel-Palestine and things like that, I think is pretty obvious on the face of it. Zionism is a particular form of nationalism, a Jewish nationalism that invests in the state as the end-all and be-all of the fate of the Jewish people. Right? The state is everything. The state as a institution invested in race, invested in ethnicity, in supremacy as a reigning concept of the nation state, and racial hierarchies as a fundamental way to organize society. That's people who, I think many Zionists would admit that, as much as they may promote certain forms or approximations of democracy or pluralism within their societies, that is what they're ultimately invested in, a kind of the Jewish body. It is the prime body of that state. The Jewish language, Hebrew, is the dominant and dominating and subjugating language of that nation state, without a doubt. Even if they allow a little bit Arabic here or whatever it is, and some kind of toleration of one thing or another, it is by its definition a violent movement. Nationalism is interested in control over territory, control over bodies. There's no, I don't think anyone would deny that. If they would, I would question their capacity to understand what nationalism actually does. In all contexts, it's not to say that I'm, suddenly for other forms of nationalism. I think nationalism in all of its articulations,
by definition, is violent.
By definition, is interested in controlling and establishing borders and controlling its population. So that's, I think one of the consequences of the book is that, languages or modern languages as we know them, force us to think in particular ways around particular kinds of organization of society. How can we look closely at those same languages, Yiddish and any other language, to understand all those things and all those structures that do not line up with those structures of control? Oftentimes, the language wants to line up with those structures of control, and populations want to. I'm not saying that it's something inevitable about Yiddish that it would reject any of those structures, but that at least Yiddish wears a lot of its inconsistencies on its sleeve. It wears its hybridity on its sleeve, even within its very name. This idea of Yiddishkeit, it wears its kind of uncomfortable set of cultural convergences a little bit more obviously.
You say throughout the book, I think you say like how the identity is in the hyphen.
Mm-hmm.
It exists in that in-between space.
The energy does. I don't know about identity, but certainly the energy or the motion of the language is, I think, critical. You sort of can't Yiddish doesn't let you rest in that sense.
Yeah. So to get more, a little bit, just to understand a little more explicitly, how then you were saying how Yiddish sort of formalized itself, the Yiddish we kind of think of today in the 19th century, which is also what Zionism was getting its start. So what is the interplay between those two? How did Yiddish, as it was, for lack of a better term, normalizing, either frustrate um, or sort of grease the wheels of that Jewish national project at a time that nationalism in the nation state, in a broad sense, was becoming the thing.
Yeah. I should also mention the word empire as part of that. So I say the word nation state, but I'm also thinking in terms of empire.
Yeah. Nation state is empire.
They coincide with one another. So I don't want to leave that out of there. I haven't yet during this time we're talking. I just want to make sure that it's also there.
Right.
But yeah, no, I would say I don't think of Hebrew and Yiddish as in oppositional terms. They work together often, even as they were fighting. Their fighting is in fact a form of cooperation between these different populations that want Yiddish to be the language of Jewish peoplehood, or Hebrew to be the language of Jewish peoplehood. There's big fights in the early 20th century and going through the 1930s, but that fight is actually a kind of shared agreement that there is such a thing as a Jewish national language, that there needs to be a kind of Jewish coherence around a single language. They work together, and in fact, Hebrew, modern Hebrew as we know it, or Hebrew that is spoken in Israel today, is in itself so deeply informed by Yiddish, its very constructions, its very rhythms, that it's hard to separate them.
There's another kind of Deutsch, you might say.
Yeah, no, that's the whole thing, is that Hebrew wants to present itself as the continuous language of the Jewish people from the beginning of time, say, right from the Bible to the present.
A small ambition.
This idea that this is an ancient language for a modern people, of a revitalization of the language, or a rebirth of the language from a dead language, but Hebrew was never dead, in the sense that it was always incorporated into all the languages that Jews spoke over those 2,000 years, right? But this idea that something must die, or that something of the Jewish past must be killed in order for this particular form of Hebrew to take over, is an extraordinarily fundamental logic of Jewish nationalism in that sense. And so too with Yiddish, right? Yiddish needs to be normalized. It needs to kill or destroy or obfuscate all those things that don't really make sense within it in order to become a normal language of a normal and normalized population. So they work together in that sense, and they merge, or one takes over the other, one subsumes the other in some way, or tries to, it fails, or that you can recover within Hebrew speech today all the languages and all the sort of hybridities that come within its immigrant and post-immigrant populations, whether that be Russian, various North African languages, and Arabic and Arabic-speaking Jews, and the way that works itself into Hebrew today. So Hebrew is so much a fusion language, much like Yiddish is. Hebrew,
despite how it's presented often,
Hebrew has an extraordinarily small vocabulary. It's like a very weak language in that sense. They didn't have much to work with. They just had the biblical and rabbinic canons to work with. So it's not like this just a small vocabulary. And so, an immigrant population that came with its own language instincts from, mostly early speakers of Hebrew were all Russian and Yiddish speakers, that inevitably that's how it would work. It would just be like, there would just be millions of calques and thousands of just borrowing, not just of words and of phrases, but of whole constructions, even word order and grammar.
So this reminds me.
So
yeah,
the contemporary linguist, I'm blanking on his name, but he would refer to it as Yisraelit, as Israel. You speak Israeli, not Hebrew. But how different the language is from its biblical and Mishnaic precedents.
And you mentioned about empire. You were talking about how Yiddish has, the examples you gave, showed up in the United States, showed up in South Africa, showed up in Far East Asia. This is obviously Yiddish, like many cultures and languages embedded in a European context, following the roots of empire.
Yeah.
And figuring out how they can kind of fit into those imperial structures.
Yeah. So Hebrew has a similar life like that. One could call Hebrew a global language as well. And my friend Tal Chabowski, who's also here in Germany somewhere, would think of that, or try to restore the olamiyut, the worldliness of Hebrew, both as a language of, say, Jewish textuality, that's circulated around the globe, but also to break it off in that sense from some of from its now central component as like a language of state violence.
So, given that the nation state is probably not going anywhere anytime soon, it is still sort of the organizing principle of politics,
And empire, yeah.
and empire. Um, what is sort of your message of your manifesto? Like, I'm trying to think, like, living in the world that we live in, what are you trying? How are you trying to get people to think when it comes to this sort of multiplicity of language and languages, as we said, the hybridity, the duality, the living in the hyphen, yet at the same time in this world of very like in and out.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. This doesn't have anything to do with language,
Excellent.
but it's, I think, analog in some way. So had students of mine at Harvard University who were not satisfied with Harvard Law for political and social reasons. They just like, and what was the impulse of any college student? It's like, oh, I need to start a new organization. I need to like build an alternative to Hillel,
The synagogue you go to, the synagogue you don't.
something like that. Or just sort of like, that's, we need to get certain amounts of funding in order to pay for this or that thing, our speaker we want to bring so that we can meet together in this room or that room. And so we need to, have an official thing that has a charter, or has an Instagram account, whatever it is. And I said to them, what about doing something that's not institutional? Like, what if you just created you just met together in some way? Or you did something like, also it's a concern of undergraduate students so that they can make something and then pass it on to the next students because they're about to graduate.
And put another seat.
These students I think were not understood in CV, but sort of urgency and need for certain kinds of continuity. Because everything is endowed or everything lasts forever, or like, whatever it is, these kinds of sort of reproducibility, which we also associate with certain kind of biological impulse around populations that kind of need to create something and then keep it alive forever. So your institutions come to mirror our own biological reality. So we need to make sure that Evo survives, right? Or whatever it is, that kind of logic, which drives dollars. And this notion drives investment in certain ways. And this notion from Lila Gorham Berman, where she was talking about, nonprofits in the United States, Jewish nonprofits in the United States, and some donor told her at some point that at some point for many of these communities that are dwindling within the United States or centralizing more in cities, that there'll be tons of money left, but no Jews, because these places are endowed to last forever. And be institutions and institutionalized even beyond the Jewish populations that they serve. And so, so this question I had for my student was like, well, what are the alternative kinds of community building you can do that don't have that same institutional connection or sort of state-like structures imposed upon them? And that was actually kind of interesting for them. They were like, oh yeah, we could just get together. We could just like have a reading group. We could, and that way they couldn't be targeted by outside, groups that wanted to sort of identify particular kinds of political groups in the campus or something like that. So, it also is a way of protection. If you're not institutionalized, it's harder to recognize you by those different sort of sets of state powers or powers adjacent to the state that want to control. It's hard to control something that's not legible to the state.
I think this is what like the Trump administration is finding hard about designating Antifa as a terrorist organization. Yeah. It's not really a thing.
It's not really a thing. So that, and this is a sort of a very anarchist principle in some sense, but moving beyond whatever labels you want to put on it, like what are the language practices we can have that, and groups and groupings that we make that don't have that kind of institutional ambition, or in part have an institutional ambition, but that reserves space for everything else that might happen. Chaotic, creative, strange, short-lived things to come out of it as well. So I absolutely benefit from institutionalization, and I have a job that
yes,
that's I'm not.
We're not knocking institutions.
Which should stop funding Evo or something like that. Absolutely not. Or that in the case of naming it, we should stop calling it Yiddish and call it Teich. I'm not saying that, but that reserve space or find opportunities for a kind of Teichier experience in which you're sort of, things are more fluid, things are open, things are, harder to pin down. And that it gives things a little bit more freedom, and that the stakes are lower, right? And so a lot of times people will come to Yiddish and feel like every word they say is like really weighted, whether from the traumas of the past or the possible traumas of the future. There's like, we really need to save Yiddish or something like that. And that
It's
can
constantly dying. There's
Yeah.
always been Yiddish is dying.
Yes,
We're the last
right,
ones.
a little bit about that. It's been dying for 200 years. And like, what if we like pulled, like sort of loosened the reins a little bit on those and allowed other kinds of practices to come in? And that, that's what I'm interested in, both in terms of my teaching, um, even as I benefit from institutionalization, try to figure out like, why else would someone be interested in this thing beyond saving it? What else can we do together besides conserve it? And what might that mean for other forms of modern Jewish practices today? Like, what does that mean for something like the synagogue? So famously, the synagogue is this institution in the United States, say, as a post-war blooming of like, bourgeoisification or middle classification of the American Jewish population. Those synagogues are falling apart. And people don't go to them. They don't have the same kind of reproducibility that was imagined in the 1950s and 1960s, and even through the 90s. What can we do for collective Jewish communal spiritual life that is not synagogue, or that is something other than, or adjacent to, or totally unrelated to those things that would, lead to different kinds of Jewish communal formation? So, I'm not the first person to say that, obviously, either, but, my Teich is sort of aligned with that kind of pushing for, I don't want to call them alternative because that imagines that they are still dependent on some kind of normal, but just to do something otherwise and elsewhere.
So to play with stereotypes, you're just telling Jews to be a little less neurotic.
No, more neurotic.
More neurotic in a less institutional way.
It's just sort of, like, in some sense, it involves both leaning into stereotype and also giving, like, letting go of the reins. So, like, stereotype is something that one is always neurotic about, always worried about, and thereby fulfills the stereotype, but unconsciously, you sort of become it.
It's a tragic kind of thing.
Yeah.
The thing you're trying to fight
What
against.
happens if you're just like, actually, I'm just going to be the stereotype? And and that,
Novakovich at your service.
Yeah, or lean into it in a particular way that is playful and lets it become something else. So for instance, like, Yiddish is thought to be trashy or vulgar in some way, and so I'm translating a romance novel. I'm going to give you the trashy Yiddish, but it's not the trashy that you're expecting, right? It's not.
This is not the trash you were looking for.
Yes, exactly. Sort of a Jedi mind trick. But those are the kinds of things I'm thinking about. So, lean into your neuroses in some sense, but not the ones that you are expecting. Not to ruin the neurotic shtick.
No, please.
The Woody Allen shtick, the neurotic shtick, is a form of misogyny. And Woody Allen is a misogynist figure who uses his supposed weakness in order to dominate women in all of his films. That is on one foot a critique of Woody Allen, and maybe I'll get in trouble for it, whatever. But that,
I don't think Woody Allen was watching talking about Bupkes, but he's welcome to join us.
The forward, the wave of a certain kinds of Jewish masculinity from Woody Allen to Larry David involves a certain, like, it depends on using that neurosis as a way to dominate women, right?
And other forms of control, I'd say, as well.
Sure, over comedy, over entertainment space, over language in a particular way. So, what are the other forms of neuroses that one can lean into that seem to align with that figure, but then move it elsewhere? Not necessarily even undermine it, but just go elsewhere.
Well, the Bupkes is all about finding new ways of being neurotic.
Okay.
But I think all this talking has really worked up an appetite.
Yes.
And so we got lunch. So talk amongst yourselves. Speaking of verklempt.
Yes.
Saul Noam Zaritt, thank you so much. It's been great. You should get the book. It's super fascinating. And I think speaks a lot to, I guess, to sum up sort of your last idea, as Groucho Marx said, never be part of a club that would have you as a member. Yes. And don't be part of the not club that would not have you as a member.